Georgina Energy aims to become one of the top 4 global producers of helium and hydrogen. It aims to do that by developing 2 projects in the highly prospective Hussar and Amadeus basins in Australia. The company listed on the London Stock Exchange in July by way of a reverse takeover. I am delighted to be joined by the Chief Executive, Anthony Hamilton. So, Anthony, good to talk to you 1 month on from your listing, and we'll talk about the investment landscape in just a bit. But first of all, what is it you have that gave you the confidence to tell investors you have assets in the, quote, most potentially significant resource basins in the Asia Pacific?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Georgina's been a journey. Almost just over 5 years, and it came about by a meeting between myself, my partner Mark, and a gentleman called John Hugh. And John is a 50-year veteran of the oil and gas industry in Australia. In fact, he's a founding director of Central Petroleum. And John has had a concept which 10 years ago couldn't sell to anybody. Fast forward 10 years, and the concept was that there are over 200 drilled and abandoned wells between WA, the Northern Territory, and South Australia. Originally drilled between the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and they were drilled for oil. And by and large, when they didn't strike oil, they were closed in. But of course, what a lot of the wells did was they encountered gas. And more importantly, it's now become common knowledge many years later that the Heavy Tree or the Townsend subsalt formation hosts helium, hydrogen, and natural gas. And the percentages are in excess of 9% helium and 11 to 12% hydrogen. So we decided, along with all of the various consultants we had working with us, to start looking at targets. And that's where Hussar and Mount Winter came in. They both sit, one sits in the Amadeus Basin, which has the Heavy Tree Formation or subsalt, and the other sits in the Hussar Basin, which has the Townsend Formation subsalt. Both of these were not penetrated. Where the Heavy Tree Formation has been penetrated, very high percentages of helium and hydrogen have been encountered. So it was obvious to us that we selected 2 projects previously drilled. We say in our presentations 100% successfully. Yes, they were. They drilled the hole 100% successfully to the basement for the purposes of oil and didn't strike oil. So from our perspective, all the information, the well completion reports, the logs, the 2D seismic, which although it's 40 years old, provided us with an immediate window into the very thing that we were looking for.
Okay, because I was going to ask you, why would the previous owner abandon a 100 success rate well? But you've just explained that. But I'm still wanting to know how challenging the geology is at your assets.
So all of these assets sit within the central super basin, which is roughly 2 million square kilometres in Central Australia. And a lot is known about it. A lot is known about the geology. As I said, over 200 wells have been plugged and abandoned, apart from the production wells that are all operating through the region. And Australia is famous for its oil and gas, and in particular, the geological settings that provide natural gas, helium, and hydrogen. So from our perspective, it was almost obvious. You've heard the saying, you can't see the wood for the trees. And I always go back to the original story about Qatar. When you realise that when they originally drilled Qatar back in the 50s and 60s, they drilled it for oil. Didn't get much oil. So they effectively handed the assets back to the Qataris, who here we are, 50 years later, It's the richest country on the planet because of the natural gas. So it's very much that case.
All right. I am thinking about other aspects of Australia. We've got to think about the Aborigines and the indigenous owners. So do you actually own the assets that you have? Are you still in negotiation with the current landowners?
So in Australia, we have 100% ownership of our permit at Hussar, granted by the Department of Energy, Mineral Industry, Resources and Safety, DEMAS. And we also have an agreement with the traditional landowners. We already have a native title land access agreement, which was executed last year. And we have an extremely good relationship with the native title and traditional landowners. And that is largely because we have a consultant that works for us, and his name is Bob Liddell. He is, in fact, I believe he holds an Order of Australia medal, an OAM, and he was granted that by the Queen back in 2013. He's actually a indigenous elder, Aboriginal indigenous elder. In fact, he's so good at what he does that he was retained by the US government to negotiate when they were doing their indigenous negotiations with the Indians there. So Bob has been fundamental and instrumental in securing our native title access agreements and making sure that we comply with all the requirements that are set upon us. So yes, we do own 100% of Hussar. In the case of Mount Winter, it's been under application for 16 years. And we achieved something that no many people did, and that is that the Central Land Council notified us that on the 11th of September this year, we will meet with the traditional landowners to secure from them their permission to grant us a conversion to a full EP. And again, Bob Liddell, along with representatives of the company, will fly to Alice Springs and they will meet with the traditional landowners and they will put forward what we plan to do. Everything that we do is to the benefit of the Indigenous community. And we already have our agreement in Hussar as proof of that. So we have a high degree of confidence. And again, once the Indigenous community confirms the right to negotiate and put a land access agreement in place, then that essentially allows the government to issue a full EP to the partners.
Okay, so it's good to hear that you've got an Indigenous negotiator, but what about the rest of the team? You know, what experience does management have within this industry and working in Australia?
So myself, John and Mark have operated in Australia, me for about 40 odd years, as well as all over the world. John for 50 years. I was actually brought up in country Western Australia. My father was a policeman and he decided it was a great idea to get posted to every remote location in Western Australia, which meant I went to schools in Laverton, Leonora, Menzies, Mullawar, Kalgoorlie. So I have a very, very good understanding of the community element of that. But at the same time, I've worked in gold mines, I've worked in oil and gas, and I've worked very closely with the Indigenous communities, as has John, and obviously with Bob. So operationally, we have an extensive background in operation, including the Gulf of Mexico, the west coast of Africa. We have an extremely experienced team that has a very, very clear understanding of the Indigenous requirements and our obligations, I might add.
Okay, we'll come on to the obligations to the shareholders in a minute, but it almost sounds as though you're itinerant. So I want to know, will you stay with this project? You know, what is the plan? Is it to drill more, get more data, open the data room for joint venture partners to analyze, or is it to prove up and sell on?
No, this has been a 5-year journey. And we've very clearly stated our aspiration. And our aspiration is to become a global partner in the helium and hydrogen market through our well redevelopment program. We want to become number 4 in the world for helium and hydrogen. I'm not interested. I'm not doing this to sell to somebody. We are doing this to turn it into a major production company in the helium and hydrogen market. And we have a concept, and we put an announcement out, I think, on the 29th to say that now that we're listed and we're developing Hussar and Mount Winter as a priority, we've just finished reviewing 168 other wells. We then reduced that list down to 26, 16 in the Amadeus, 10 in Hussar, in the Officer Basin, and that 26 is now down to 10, and we will work on targeting the top 2 from there. At the same time, we've executed a confidentiality agreement with an Australian production company. And the reason we've done that is because obviously ownership and rights to the targets that we're pursuing requires us to negotiate with different parties. So as I've said, we make no apologies. Our aspirations may be lofty, but they are based on a very clear plan and target that started 5 years ago.
Okay, I'm just thinking about from concept to commerciality, because obviously this is going to be costly. So aside from the money made at IPO, what is funding these lofty aspirations?
Our view is, look, in the first instance, the money raised in IPO will fund the development and drilling of Hussar and the establishment of Mount Winter. We have the other element of our concept, which is we're going to sell the gas at the wellhead. And the reason we're going to do that is because that mitigates the significant cost of building a separation plant on surface. And we already have an MOU with an off-taker, and that MOU understandably has some basic terms in it, of which it includes the reimbursement of our development costs once we get gas to the wellhead and we reach a formalised agreement. So initially our funding is essentially the IPO, followed by the funding via the off-taker, provided by reimbursement of our costs. And then obviously, if we're successful in developing Hussar to a full production profile, then we would hope that the cash flow from that would fund our future development, along with the reimbursement of our development costs from the off-taker.
Anthony, how much skin in the game does management have?
Mark and I have £2.5 million of our own money in this. And we did not take a salary from Georgina for the first 5 years of its gestation. We do have salaries now, but no, we have a fair bit of skin in the game, as you would say.
Okay, and in terms of those salaries, is it industry sector standard? You're not buying a yacht?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, no, and we're not going to get rich off the salaries that we're being paid. And they're fully disclosed in the prospectus. They're industry standards, I believe, 150,000 for Mark and I, and 105,000 for John Hugh, our technical director. And that's for 100% of our time. Okay.
So there's no distractions. Why did you come to the main market by way of a reverse takeover? It's not necessarily unorthodox, it's just a bit clunky.
We came to London for 2 reasons: the prestige of the LSE, the history of the LSE for oil and gas, its foundations. It's still seen as the premier exchange. And when we originally came here in 2019, the LSE changed their rules, which meant you had to have a minimum market cap of 50 mil. Then we had a look at AIM, and COVID came along and torpedoed that. And then by complete reverse osmosis, we were approached by a company, in this case Triple M, to reverse into it. But more importantly, during that process, the LSE was changing its admission rules and basically removing the standard list, which meant that we would be listed on the main board. And from our perspective, the prestige of being a London Stock Exchange main board listed company holds a lot of weight overseas, in Australia, in fact, anywhere else for that matter. So we have seen a very significant change in the approach by the people that we are dealing with, whether it's government or the other industry players that we talk to here in Australia, to the fact that we are now an LSE main board listed public company. And so there's the whole reason. It might have been a torturous path, but funnily enough, the adventure we started in 2019, we ended up exactly where we wanted to be in 2024.
Okay, that is quite a journey, a long time, therefore, to work on a prospectus. Now, I've worked on a prospectus, done well. It is a thing of beauty. Was yours a thing of beauty? Because this, after all, is the document that your company will be judged against in time.
Absolutely. It was a document of significant proportions, and we went through the LSE, the FCA and the UKLA's procedures. Our accounts, Georgina's accounts have been audited since 2019, and they are fully compliant. Our auditors are UK registered. In terms of the CPR, again, the author of the CPR was required to meet the minimum requirements of the LSE. So the company has been examined in every way, shape and form, along with the board and the directors. So, you know, we had collectively with Mark and I and our private equity shareholders, we had raised over £6.5 million to get Georgina to where it was. And yes, the prospectus is a thing of beauty, and I've never really heard it called that, but it is a comprehensive document with full disclosure in it, and there's absolutely everything that is needed is in there. And yes, you're correct. We will live and die by that document.
Okay, so finally, Anthony, I can see that your chosen background is sort of like intergalactic, but of course helium is needed for space travel, so I'm kind of understanding the visual metaphor. But what will investors hear about before the end of the calendar year?
I mean, our first RNS went out 8 days after we were listed. And we've basically been putting out RNSs pretty much continuously over that period. Our last RNS went out on the 29th. We told the market what we were doing. Clearly what the market will be looking for is the granting of the permit from DEMAs to drill. But as I've said previously, everything to do with that, the one thing that was stopping us was having the funding. Once we had the funding, because you need to be able to prove to the government that you have the capital to complete the task that you're seeking approval for. All of the environmental, all of the regulatory submissions, the risk management, the site preparation, the health and safety, we've reprocessed the seismic The original seismic is 40 years old, but then it was reprocessed in 2002, and that only just became available to us recently. So we are working on the resource scale and size. We are obviously working on the new targets. We've got a meeting on the 11th of September in Alice Springs. There'll be an announcement on the outcome of that to do with Mount Winter. There'll be further announcements. Obviously, we are on target to commence re-entry at Hussar in December. And everything and all the elements of that are in place. One of the key elements was the engagement of Aztec Well Construction, who will oversee and run the whole program. And so there's a lot of news flow that will continue to come out between now and ultimately when we announce that we're on site and commencing the re-entry program. And one thing I told the contractors at Aztec, take your camera. We want lots of pictures because a picture tells 1,000 words.
It certainly does, as has this interview. Thank you very much indeed, Anthony Hamilton, Chief Executive of Georgina Energy. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Sarah.